This is going to be a talk that's based on some work I've done previously. So I've done some work on analyzing trust and also on the relationship between trust, epistemic coverage and fake news. So I'm trying to expand a bit on that, but I think probably the way the talk is going to go is it's going to be me giving my account of trust briefly, and then talking about epistemic coverage, then trying to bring the two things together. So the kind of the thesis that I want to defend is that weak or absent trust relations in institutional testifiers impact on perceptions of epistemic coverage, which in turn influence belief formation. So institutional testifiers, what I mean by that is testifiers that have a kind of privileged position within an epistemic environment. The kind of examples that are kind of the easiest to give would be mass media organizations, politicians, experts within society as well. So often these are testifiers whose testimony is treated as authoritative. And we might think that in a well-functioning epistemic environment, it's particularly important that their testimony is authoritative. Let me give you a little bit about where I'm coming from with this talk. So I used to work in Kazakhstan, and I was there for part of the pandemic. And it was just very interesting how some people who I thought were very smart, and in everyday activities, I think they really were very smart. They had some very strange beliefs about, what was happening with the pandemic and vaccines and masks and different things like that. And so I was trying to understand what's going on. Like, why do people that seem otherwise very smart have these views that to me seem very unusual, very strange? And one feature of that environment is that there is a lack of trust. And I mean, that lack of trust is, in these societies, is often well grounded. So there can be very negative past experiences, or it can be the case that media often isn't very trustworthy. That's where I'm coming from. That's the kind of motivation for the talk, so trying to understand what's going on in those circumstances. Another kind of interest that I have is to try to take a more systematic approach to understanding why you can have individuals or communities ending up with these very divergent beliefs. So rather than trying to give an answer that's located at the level of the individual, I think if we take social epistemology seriously, then we should at least have some interest in seeing if there's a more systematic answer, or an answer that doesn't kind of reduce the problem to the level of the individual, and rather tries to understand maybe what's going on at a societal level. This is the definition or analysis of trust that I'm using. So R trust S to F, if and only if. R, the truster dispositionally believes. S, the trustee is competent or will be competent to phi, and R approves of what she dispositionally believes is the will of S to phi, where S is something about which R cares. Okay, so it's a bit technical, and for my purposes, it's not essential that you think that this really is an if and only if analysis. I think if it works in lots of cases, that's fine for this talk. The other thing I would say is essentially this can be broken down into two main components that make it probably more kind of familiar for those of you who work on the trust literature. There's essentially belief in competence requirement, and there's essentially a goodwill requirement, or a belief in goodwill requirement as well. So it's taken as very standard that in order for one person to trust another person to do something, then there has to be a belief or a disposition to believe that the person has the relevant competence. So I'm not going to trust Roland to drive me to the airport if I know he doesn't drive, right? I won't trust him to do that because I don't think he has the competence, right? Now, there is a kind of little kind of extra thing to add here, which is that it seems that there can be cases where you can trust someone to do something in the future where they don't currently have that competence, but you have some expectation that they're going to gain that competence. So, for example, Artur might trust his sister to give the family medical advice after she finishes her medical degree, right? So she doesn't currently have the competence to give the medical advice, but he has good reason to think that she's going to get that competence, and he's trusting that she will do this in the future. So it doesn't have to actually be that the competence is there at the moment, as long as there's an expectation that it's going to come. The other aspect of this is approving of what you think the will of the other person is, which is my way of doing a goodwill requirement. So the goodwill part is, I think there's really broad agreement about the competence requirement, whereas goodwill is a bit more controversial. There are some cases that look like a problem for goodwill accounts. So Holton has a few cases. And so if you thought of goodwill as being directed at the other person, that, so when you trust someone to do something, a requirement is that they have goodwill towards you, it doesn't really look like it's going to work. And so there's a couple of examples. So one example is, suppose you have divorced parents who are at each other's throats. Well, it still seems that one can trust the other one to look after the kids for the weekend without thinking that that person has goodwill towards them. Another example is, maybe this one might not be as obvious, but another example is in a war situation where people are trying to kill each other, it could still be the case that one side trusts that the other side is not going to fire on them if they raise a white flag and come out of where they're hiding or whatever. So having goodwill directed at the person doesn't seem to be the requirement. So then the tricky thing is, well, in what sense should we understand goodwill? I think it's a mistake to think of it as some kind of moral will. So I don't think it should be thought of as good in that sense. And another example, I think, supports that position. So you can imagine a case of people who are bank robbers, and one of the bank robbers trusts another bank robber to wait in the getaway car and to drive them when their business is complete. And I think that can happen without them having some kind of twisted idea that what they're doing is moral. I think it's possible, conceptually possible, that someone can think that in a particular case, what they trust the other person to do is not something moral, but it's still something that they think that they should do. So it would have to involve a broader sense of should. Or at least, the better way for me to put it is, they think that the person has the right kind of will in this situation, or the will that they approve of. I'm going to talk about epistemic coverage a lot now, and I'm going to come back to trust a bit at the end. But one relevance of this is that if we understand how trust works, when we come to situations where there's a kind of failing of trust, then we can think about, well, which of the components might be lacking, and how can we try to generate appropriate trust, if this is correct. We understand what trust involves. So if we understand that trust involves approving of the will of the other agent, then if you want to generate trust, the idea, a kind of obvious idea, would be to try to generate some kind of agreement about what we should want, what our kind of responses should be to a situation that we find ourselves in. So I know that's at a kind of general level, but often trust is like this. If I trust you to look after my cat, I'm not explicitly thinking, oh, okay, that means I think that you will feed her when she's hungry and do X and Y and Z. There's so much there that it can't, I don't think it can be easily broken down into individual propositions that need to be satisfied. One very quick point as well is that I think this gets neglected a bit too, but sometimes when you trust someone to do something, part of your trusting them to do it is it's going to be let down if they go too far in maybe taking care of that thing that you've asked them to take care of. So epistemic coverage. So this is an idea from Sandy Goldberg, maybe the nicest person in philosophy, I'm just putting it there. Okay, so his claim is that one can be justified in belief P, given that if P were not true, one would have heard about it. To put it simply, we're not sort of isolated individuals detached from the world. We exist in an environment, and we can be justified in certain beliefs because of how our environment functions. And for most of us, who I'm guessing most of us, access news websites maybe every day or every few days, a person like that can end up with a justified belief about something because of something that hasn't happened, essentially because of the way their environment functions. So you could do a positive rendition of this as well. I've learned something at one point, and my continued belief enjoys epistemic justification on the basis that if it were no longer true, then I would have heard about it, right? So it's just a different way of putting it. So the first example is I can know that Joe Biden didn't die yesterday, or if we want to be very cautious, didn't die last week, because if he had died, I would have heard about it. Right, so that's the idea. That's because of the environment I'm in. Of course, if the environment was very different, then, that's not a basis for thinking that Joe Biden didn't die. So the second example, this is at a more personal level. So I just want to show here that usually the examples that I've come across related to epistemic coverage are like this, kind of based on a kind of media environment. But I think it is possible that could be at a more personal level too. So Dana believes that her partner Aslan went to the office as usual yesterday. She saw Aslan yesterday evening, and if he hadn't gone to the office, then she would have heard about it. Now, of course, it's not like this is a complete guarantee, but the idea is that this is how this couple works, that he will say if something out of the ordinary happened. And so she has a basis then for believing that something out of the ordinary didn't happen because he hasn't said it. Okay, so explaining epistemic coverage. So what one may be justified in believing on the basis of not having heard otherwise can be expected to vary from epistemic environment to epistemic environment. Similarly, one's perception of what one is justified in believing may depend on one's perception of their epistemic environment. So this is where stuff about conspiracies and fake news comes in. With this explanation, I'm not saying this explains all the cases of conspiracy theories or belief in fake news. I'm hoping it explains, a good portion of those cases, but I'm not trying to say this accounts for all those cases. Again, the idea is, well, if someone thinks that their epistemic environment is such that they don't know that Joe Biden didn't die last week on the basis that they think that they wouldn't have heard about it if he did, they're missing out on a kind of source of justification that they would enjoy, or at least they think they're missing out on a source of justification that they would enjoy if they believed that their epistemic environment was essentially better. So one may believe that Biden didn't die yesterday because one thinks that one's epistemic environment is such that one has exposure to news sources that inform audiences of such newsworthy items, like the death of a president, or, for example, a very large earthquake in Portugal. Essentially, one has a view about the epistemic workings of the environment or environments that one inhabits. And actually, this is probably influences an awful lot of beliefs. If you think about your epistemic environment, depending on how you think about your epistemic environment, you probably think that you have a lot more coverage or a lot less coverage. And that can be expected to influence a lot of beliefs that you have. And so maybe goes some way in trying to understand how some people have conspiratorial beliefs where others are left scratching their head and saying, how can they think so much is false or think so much is different from how we normally understand things? So on some matters, it's reasonable to think that sometimes one can't rely on one's epistemic environment in this sort of way, right? So I guess for most of us, we think that we can rely on our epistemic environment to be justified in believing that President Biden didn't die last week. But I mean, we don't think this about everything, right? On those matters that I haven't heard about, it doesn't mean that it hasn't happened, or it doesn't mean that we have a justification for thinking it hasn't happened. So this perception might be based on social norms that influence what people talk openly about and what they don't talk openly about in one's epistemic environment. I might think, well, that this particular person hasn't told me about this really traumatic experience doesn't mean that I should think it hasn't happened, even if they do generally tell me lots of stuff about their personal experiences, because, you know, there's a norm in place where people might think it's better not to say these things. And it doesn't have to just be that. It could be something like, well, people don't think this kind of thing is important to say. I mean, it could be a different situation where this is not kind of worthy of communication. And so again, for that kind of situation, if my epistemic environment is like that, or perceive my epistemic environment to be like that, then I shouldn't think when I don't get that information that it kind of bears on whether that's true or not. Another kind of reason that you might not get epistemic coverage or perceive yourself not to have epistemic coverage is simply one's sources in one's epistemic environment, right? So I don't have certain sources about, say, you know, I don't have communication with some of the participants at the conference, and so I don't have any reason to expect that I'll hear that they missed their flight if they missed their flight. So I'll give you the second example. So if in a corrupt dictatorship, a government official has stolen billions of euro from that country, and that's where I live in that corrupt dictatorship, then I don't expect to have heard about it, right? I mean, I understand how that epistemic environment works. I know that kind of stuff can happen without me being told it's happening. So the fact I'm not told that it has happened doesn't make me think it hasn't happened. So one may think that one lacks coverage for belief in certain propositions. In fact, one may think that one's epistemic environment is such that institutional testifiers won't say or will hide certain events. If one encounters claims that fall into this category, then the absence or even the denial of these claims by those sources will not be a basis for deterring belief. So even if P isn't true, I would hear that P is true. So that's a kind of stronger version. So this is not that, well, that I haven't heard about it gives me justification for thinking that hasn't happened. This is saying that even if P isn't true, I would hear that P is true, right? So the example I think I have for this somewhere is even if the leader is doing a terrible job, I'll still hear that he's doing a good job. Okay, so thinking this may be entirely reasonable in some circumstances, okay, I've just given you that example, Similarly, one may expect to hear that the government has done a bad job on, say, the economy, even if it's not true, right? So maybe in a different kind of political environment that's, has a more antagonistic media, some media outlets will just say that the government has done a bad job with the economy, even if it's not true, right? That's what you could expect, given how that environment works. So for some propositions, we take our epistemic environment to be such as to provide us with epistemic coverage. For such propositions, we may hold that their being asserted in our epistemic environment isn't on the basis of them being true. Okay, so this is where trust is coming back in, so on cue. So one basis for judging that one's epistemic environment is such that one lacks epistemic coverage in many circumstances is lacking trust in the institutional testifiers in one's environment. So it seems like the situation wouldn't be so bad if you just thought to yourself, okay, I have this group of friends in the environment I operate in, and they really can't be trusted when they talk about who the best football team is. But in a case where it's institutional testifiers like the mass media or like politicians, if that's the place where you lack trust, then it can be expected that you won't take yourself to have epistemic coverage for lots of propositions. Okay, so one might lack trust in those testifiers because one does not believe in the competence or goodwill of some of those testifiers. So essentially, I'm just saying what's involved in trust here. And so when we understand what's involved in trust here, we can understand what can go wrong. And so either you might think that the whoever the source is, they lack competence, or probably more relevant for kind of conspiracy theorists or believers in fake news, they lack in the goodwill. They lack belief in the goodwill of the source. So a consequence of not trusting institutional testifiers is that they're saying or not making claims about a proposition isn't necessarily taken to bear on the truth of the proposition, or may even be taken to negatively bear on the truth of the proposition. So this approach predicts that an absence of trust in institutional testifiers can be expected to lead to skepticism in the relevant propositions or belief in an alternative. So I haven't talked so much about the belief in alternative part. It would seem to me just, if you really took your environment to be like this, the rational thing to do would be to be very skeptical. But of course, that's not what happens in practice for lots of people. So for example, the newspaper X says P isn't, so it says P, says not P, isn't taken as counter evidence to social media claim that P. And this is where you're really at a disadvantage when you don't trust your epistemic environment, in particular the institutional testifiers, because if you don't trust them, then you come across other claims, and you don't really have a basis for using the testimony of the institutional testifiers as counter evidence for those claims. Okay, I'll stop here. Thank you.